A Pentagon policy advisor has resigned from his job, and he has cited what he refers to as Defense Secretary Mark Esper's violation of his oath of office. Now, this is specifically tied to how Esper handled the vicious attacks against peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C., also Donald Trump could do his photo op following his Rose Garden speech. Now, Mark Esper, who is the defense secretary, is trying to play dumb now and act as if he was completely unaware of what was going on. But before we get to that, let me tell you why James Miller resigned. So he resigned from the Defense Advisory Board in a clear rebuke of Defense Secretary Mark Esper's role in the violent dispersal of anti-racism protesters from Lafayette Square for a presidential photo op. Miller denounced Esper visibly supporting the excessive crowd control measures, calling it a violation of the nation's top defense official's oath of office. He even released an open letter so the public can read his reasoning behind his resignation, which I think makes a lot of sense. He says to Esper in this open letter, "You recited that same oath on July 23rd, 2019, when you were sworn in as Secretary of Defense. On Monday, June 1st, 2020, I believe that you violated that oath." Miller also wrote that he feared Esper may be asked to exploit U.S. military power by wielding it in ways that further undermine the Constitution and harm Americans. And those fears are certainly warranted because in a story that just broke, we've just learned that the members of the military who were in D.C. to basically help protect Donald Trump, or AKA Bunker Boy, and these are people who viciously contributed to what happened to those protesters. They were supposed to be sent home. Esper was supposed to be sending them home, and we just learned that that is not going to happen. That the government has decided to keep these members of the military in D.C. as these protests continue. So essentially, we will continue having the military fight peaceful protesters in Washington, D.C. because Donald Trump is a giant coward who's only enabled by people who are larger cowards like Mark Esper.
Yeah, and only thinks that he looks strong when he has other people beating other innocent people and he's near it. That's an alpha male, I guess, for conservatives, apparently, because that was his plan. I think this is going forward. This should be the thing that scares people the most, I think, other than possibly the coronavirus, is what will the military do and what won't they do? And looking back over Donald Trump's time as president, it is difficult to come up with times where the military has told him no. Like, he used the largest non-nuclear armament we have in Afghanistan a few years ago. They seemed totally willing to launch into a conflict with Iran, totally unnecessarily earlier this year. I mean, they wouldn't have tanks in a parade. That's the only thing I can think of where the military said no to Donald Trump. And so, when you have the tear gassing and the buzzing people with helicopters, and now on the streets, apparently, possibly mercenaries, people, heavily armed quasi-soldiers that we have no idea who they answer to, we should all be extremely worried about Donald Trump, especially if he is fearing that he might lose the election, which, based on the polling, it looks like is certainly a possibility. We want people in positions of power who will say no, who will refuse to follow orders, and we know that the past few years, Donald Trump has been weeding those people out the entire time.
That's exactly right. I mean, he has surrounded himself with yes men, and he's fired all sorts of attorneys general. This is the type of person he is. He doesn't like any type of oversight. He doesn't like to be challenged in any way ideologically, even though there isn't really much of an ideology there other than Donald Trump looking out for Donald Trump. But Mark Esper apparently has caught wind of the backlash because he is certainly playing dumb about what happened. So let's take a quick look at a recent press address that Esper gave, and let's see if we're buying any of what he's selling here.
I did know that following the president's remarks on Monday evening, that many of us were going to join President Trump and review the damage in Lafayette Park and at St. John's Episcopal Church. What I was not aware of was exactly where we were going, when we arrived at the church and what the plans were once we got there. It was also my aim, and General Milley's, to meet with and thank the members of the National Guard who were on duty that evening in the park. It is something the president likes to do as well.
So in other words, I didn't know. I just didn't know. He claims that he had no notice before Trump led him to St. John's Episcopal Church for a photo op. And he's claiming, John, that he thought he was just going to go there to survey some of the damage that was done to the church and also talk to the troops. That's what he thought.
Yeah, it's like, the thing is that we have no reason to believe that anything any of them are saying is true.
No.
And we have no reason to believe that the clarifications they provide are true when we know Donald Trump is right now and always watching the news. And so if Esper comes out and says, you know, I didn't know why we were doing this or whatever, he's going to immediately get a call from Donald Trump. And because only weenies are left in positions of authority, he's going to immediately change his story to try to, like, make Donald Trump less angry at him, I guess. But all of it is lies. The entire purpose of that event was a big deception. We shouldn't trust any of this. And honestly, I'm inclined to just say, I don't care what Esper thought was going on there. I care about what he allowed to be done and what Barr allowed to be done, because now Barr wants us to believe that it was his idea, even though Ivanka also says it was her idea. And I don't know how Barr could actually be responsible for it, but he says it was his idea to clear people out earlier. But again, because of the threat of Antifa, even though we find out, thanks to the great reporting of Ken Klippenstein, that the FBI has found no indication that Antifa has been involved with literally any of the violence so far over multiple days of protests. So I don't trust any of them, and I really don't care. I care about what they do, not their BS excuses that they give after the fact.
Well, you have good reason to avoid trusting anyone from the Trump administration, including Mark Esper, because in that same speech, he claimed that, you know, what we saw in terms of how these peaceful protesters were treated wasn't actually what we saw. Here he is.
I also want to address a few other matters that have been raised about that evening. First, National Guard forces did not fire rubber bullets or tear gas into the crowd, as reported. Second, guardsmen were instructed to wear helmets and personal protective equipment for their own protection, not to serve as some form of intimidation. Third, military leaders, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were wearing field uniforms because that is the appropriate uniform when working in a command center and meeting with troops in the streets. Fourth, it wasn't until yesterday afternoon that we determined it was a National Guard helicopter that hovered low over a city block in D.C. Within an hour or so of learning of this, I directed the Secretary of the Army to conduct an inquiry to determine what happened and why, and to report back to me.
It's all lies.
So clear. Yeah, it's all lies. And clearly, for those of you who are watching a video version of the show as opposed to the audio podcast, we're the ones who used video to debunk the nonsense that you're hearing from Esper. So the tear gas, you can clearly see in the video. You also see these heavily armed, police with their shields and their helmets charging at not only peaceful protesters, but also the press, in order to make way for Donald Trump's ridiculous photo op. So,
well, there was that threatening guy who was sitting down with a camera, and that's why that guy had to go all Captain America on him with his riot shield. Yeah, no, I thought I saw police brutality there, but I guess it was just in my mind. Esper's got to be telling the truth.
Yeah. And finally, Esper claims that he's on our side. Okay, that he doesn't actually want to use the military against its own people.
The option to use active duty forces in a law enforcement role should only be used as a matter of last resort and only in the most urgent and dire of situations. We are not in one of those situations now. I do not support invoking the Insurrection Act.
In the YouTube super chat comments, Clayton Mill writes in and says, I thought the military also swore an oath to protect Americans from harm, not harm them, so bunker bitch, that's Donald Trump, can have a photo op. Well, I guess oaths don't really matter at all, right? Just like how the Trump administration has shown us how little regard they have for our constitutional rights.
Yeah. So it makes a good headline for Esper to say, I don't invoke using the Insurrection Act. It's like, oh, he's standing up for himself. Here's an important follow-up question. What if they don't have to? What if invoking it could prompt a response? Instead, you just do all the things you'd do if you invoked it. You send the troops in. I mean, after all, we're apparently led to believe that some helicopter pilot just decided on his own to buzz people below the level of buildings. That's something that helicopter pilots do all the time on their own. They weren't ordered to. No one's responsible. That's the cool thing, is that it was done, but no one's responsible. No one can be held responsible. The tear gassing didn't happen, even though we saw it, so no one can be responsible for that since it didn't happen. Now there's people who are not soldiers all over DC. They look like soldiers. They have the weapons and the defensive armor of soldiers, but they're not soldiers. They're not military police. We have no idea who they are. Why would you go to the trouble of using the Insurrection Act, which would produce its own headlines, when you could just do all of those things informally?
That's exactly right. And the thing that I just want Americans to be just hyper aware of moving forward, because I feel like we've ignored it for a long time. And I don't mean all of us, but in general, like our media has ignored it. I think that there's been just like this disinterest in the general public. What we do abroad, our U.S. foreign policy, is tied to what's happening within our borders today. When we turn a blind eye to this military industrial complex, which leads to, which of course focuses on that profit motive for more war, more weapons, all of the investment goes toward defense, right? You don't think that that's eventually going to turn around and negatively impact us? And by the way, if that's all you care about, if all you care about is what happens within these borders, you should care about U.S. foreign policy. But if you're uncomfortable watching our police treat American citizens the way they are, with this disgusting level of brutality, also understand that the way we treat civilians abroad is actually worse. And we're talking about civilians. We're not talking about soldiers and foreign militaries. We're talking about average people who want to have dinner with their families, who want to go to school and get educated, who want a better life for themselves. Our government has been maiming them, murdering them with no problem, referring to them as nothing more than collateral damage. So we have to take a good hard look at everything systemically in this country and how we do things. Because if we basically turn a blind eye to the government treating foreigners the way they treat them, there's no question that they'll turn around and treat us the same way, because the common, factor there is human life.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat, emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.